Before I start this video, I feel I need to provide some context. If you don't like this character, you have great reason. He arguably isn't written very well, and because of this, his plot twist in Danganronpa V3 is jarring at best and grossly offensive at worst. Pair this with cultural differences in terms of humor between Japan and the US, and you get Korekiyo Shinguji. Not to mention his disastrous-looking costume, but I want to take this video from a different angle. As you may have seen previously on my channel, I am not shy about the fact that I've been a victim of abuse. Though I won't go into the exact nature of it for my own privacy, and even my videos on the subject were purposely left vague in terms of what I endured, I want everyone watching to know that I'm speaking from a place of personal experience. In this video, I not only intend to speak from my own life perspective, but also uplift other victims and make their voices heard in terms of what it means to have a comfort character that they can relate to. I've seen a lot of videos tearing this character down, and rightfully so, but there's actually a group of people out there, especially abuse victims, who see Kyo as a kind of representation. Some have even been able to suggest evidence for this in his canon story. Now, I'm personally of the opinion that any interpretation of this character is as good as any other, and there are other victims that see this character as a gross misrepresentation of abuse victims. That is very valid and justified. His possible concept doesn't excuse the way that he was written. The intention doesn't excuse the execution. Pun intended. All I'm trying to do in this video is justify fellow victims who find comfort in Korekiyo Shinguji and provide explanations as to why this is the case. I'm Wet Blanket, and on this channel I discuss topics that I don't think get enough attention in the commentary community. So, let's start a conversation. First and foremost, if you don't watch the rest of this video, know that this was the ultimate takeaway. Kyo was taken advantage of by his sister, who had a huge power imbalance due to not only her age, but also health status. I also believe that Kyo may be neurodivergent, whether that be from birth or due to trauma. He's obviously coded that way, and since he has documented trouble with social cues, this could have further isolated him and pushed him into his sister's control. This abuse and isolation was present for all of his life, and his sister's death finally destroyed his already fragile mental state. He was a man who lost everything, and the lot he had wasn't particularly good in the first place, so he turned to loving his sister in the only way he still could after her death, by making friends for her. However, I do have a way to make this relevant to the brainwashing present in all of the students, and I will start by explaining that. In Kyo's brainwash-induced story, he and his sister had a very special relationship, and she was terminally ill for as long as Kyo could remember. As the story goes, his sister's illness won and she passed away, leaving Kyo alone and traumatized. But that's just what was fed to him, right? I don't think so. You see, complex trauma, especially of this caliber, gives you literal brain damage. For example, here's a very popular photo of a normal brain scan versus the brain scan of a traumatized orphan. As you can see, the parts of the brain that regulate emotion and the senses literally shut down. If this isn't addressed within the first few years of life, these facets can be damaged permanently. As mentioned before, his sister's illness and also his abuse was present in the most formative years of his life. This isn't damage you can just undo with brainwashing. Since Kyo didn't sign his life away to the killing game until he was legally an adult, one can argue that a large amount of the damage could have already been done. What I'm trying to say is, I think the individuals that brainwashed Kyo had to find a way to work the already existing abuse, fragile mental state, emotional irregularity, and sensory issues into his new identity. Do I think Kyo was actually a serial killer? No. But do I think he was a regular adult with complex trauma and brain damage that he may or may not have known he had sustained? Absolutely. This brainwashing, or creating of a new personality for the killing game, essentially allowed him to completely lose all of his inhibitions. All of his already present symptoms were magnified for the entertainment of the audience, and what's more, they also threw in the memory of becoming a serial killer. For funsies, you know? Now, you may be arguing that this can't be the case based on the little that we see of pre-game Kyo, but I think the pre-game version just sends home this theory more. In the pre-game, he's shy, aloof, and well-meaning. For lack of a better term, he seems repressed. But I don't know, take that as you will. Also, has anyone else thought of the fact that Kyo got one of the worst hands dealt to him, likability-wise? Now, I'm not going to say that Kyo's story is objectively better or worse than literally being sold into assassin trafficking, but really think about it. Even the assassin is very morally redeemable because she was forced into it. In fact, she sacrificed herself for it. This game is a show being broadcast to a public audience, and nobody likes the incest character. Incest characters characters are objectively pretty bad for ratings, especially being put in the same room with a magician and a fucking music major. So why would the producers of DRV3 willingly include such a double whammy? The answer? They had no choice. Brainwashing can't fix brain damage. Convincing someone who lost their arm that they still have it doesn't make their arm grow back, no matter how convinced they are. Kiyo actually was abused by his sister, and in every reality, he will always have been abused by his sister. It's tragic, and it's only made more tragic by the way it was handled. Now that we've established that abuse did happen, we must go into the most tricky and misconstrued part of Kiyo's whole character, proving the abuse itself. Now, it's obviously very hard to prove fictional abuse, and this is where I'll again say, if you do not like this character, you have the right to dislike them. In fact, I'll straight up say it. Kiyo, even if he was abused, has writing that does a really shit job of showing it, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. I will be basing my analysis largely off of a Reddit user, Analytical Critic 44's amazing explanation of Kiyo's behavior. Link in description. They make the claim that even if Kiyo isn't supposed to be written as an abuse victim, his role as a victim is equally impactful. And while I don't entirely agree with that statement, especially since he suffers from Trial 3 disease, this user still has some fantastic things to say. I first want to talk about his relationship with his sister because of how little attention is given to the complexity of affiliation with each other beyond the taboo sexual relations. When his sister personality first appears in the Chapter 3 trial, we see her giving out orders to Shinguji and how to act and behave. Her remarks are to the point and controlling. The short time that sister appears on the screen, I feel, is very indicative of her relationship with Shinguji, especially the fact that she seemed to be very controlling of his hobbies and interests in everyday life. Looking back at Kiyo's breakdown, his sister's demeanor is very controlling. At first, her telling him to calm down just seems strangely motherly. However, after he is found out, he claims he did all this killing just for her, and she chastises him and calls him greedy. This is further corroborated in Kiyo's other in-game interactions. The Reddit post takes notice of this, saying, "In Shinguji's free time events, we learned that his interest in pursuing anthropology all came from his sister pushing him to become more involved with it." Not only that, but he also mentions that his uniform was originally much simpler, but that his sister decided to handcraft her very own uniform for Shinguji. He strongly cherishes his uniform and finds it to be special to him. These two facts lead me to a conclusion that his sister took advantage of his life and admiration for her and used him as a guinea pig. As mentioned previously, his sister was very sick, always in the hospital. This, coupled with her constant control of Shinguji literally ever since they were kids, leads me to believe that anthropology was not only her way of controlling his interests, but also her way of living vicariously through him. This abuse theory is further verified by the fact that his sister just seems to have showed up in his mind one day. He has never not been under her control and did not know how to live without it, so his mind created her again. But we'll get to that later. First, that's not the only thing she tried to control. The fact that she had no friends leads me to the biggest point of their whole relationship, that she was the one who incited the incestuous relationship. As I have mentioned now, Shinguji's sister grew up without many friends, if any at all, due to her condition, and because of this I feel that their relationship wasn't that lovely, as she was probably really bitter about how unfair she was treated by life. Her interest in anthropology couldn't even be explored outside of reading books. She was unable to go into the outside world and make friends. Her time on Earth was really limited and scarce. And most importantly is that she will never be able to find someone to love, except for the one person she is constantly around. Korekiyo was sexually abused by his sister for years, and he now has PTSD because of this. Now, I'm no doctor or medical professional. I have no jurisdiction to be diagnosing anyone with anything, fictional or not. But I do have PTSD. So here's what I can tell you. Firstly, it's not usual for people with PTSD to have a Jekyll and Hyde situation with the person that abused them. However, if we've seen how grossly Danganronpa handled DID, we know that gross generalization is pretty commonplace for them. No, I believe that Kiyo's sister is a physical example of what is called a trauma bond. A trauma bond is an attachment that develops from a cycle of physical and/or emotional trauma followed by positive reinforcement. Kiyo saw himself as the only cherished person in his sister's life, and she seemed the type to never shy away from love bombing. Thus, Kiyo gained an unhealthy love, not only for the abuse, but a sort of dependence on the way he was treated. He felt indebted to her because she was sick, and to her, he was the only person in her life. She took advantage of his emotions and of his body, convinced him that it was okay, and also did acts of kindness such as making him an entire uniform to make him feel like he was loved and appreciated. As someone with a trauma disorder, I can confirm that repeated trauma becomes brain conditioning. Your abuser stays with you subconsciously even long after they're gone. Unlearning this conditioning requires a long period of intensive work and does get worse the longer it goes repressed and untreated. Come to think of it, perhaps the Jekyll and Hyde isn't such a gross overgeneralization after all. Perhaps it is merely a side effect on the already existing trauma from the brainwashing. Like I said, because of his pre-existing brain damage and actual shrinkage of parts of his brain, these pre-existing symptoms would have only been magnified by the creation of a new personality, erasing all of his inhibitions. Secondly, Korekiyo's sprites touch a lot of comfort points, especially this one. This is the one that sticks in my mind the most. This is the exact position I assume when I am triggered. This sprite also directly reflects the self-regulating comfort points associated with PTSD self-soothing. Now, when does Korekiyo use this in-game? When he's anxious, and furthermore, backed into a corner. Thirdly, he uses a lot of self-sabotaging methods. The uniform, the one his sister made him. He keeps it on as a constant reminder of the shame he feels, an outside manifestation of how his trauma is trapping him. This may not make sense to anyone not suffering from complex trauma, but let me try to explain. One of the biggest PTSD symptoms is trying to discredit your own experiences and convince yourself it didn't happen. Due to this, many PTSD sufferers may constantly try to re-traumatize themselves. It's a lose-lose situation of being sick and trying to convince yourself you're sick. Kyo wears the uniform at all times so that he never forgets. However, it's this deep shame that's trapping him. An example of this in the real world would be when trauma victims constantly check up on the people that abused them, whether that be in real life or through social media. Either this, or they will often look at old screenshots and photos and evidence of how they were mistreated if they have any at all. It reminds me of this one quote that I saw that said something along the lines of, "A sick person's number one drive is the drive to become sicker." In Korekiyo's case, he is quite literally wearing this self-sabotage, this re-traumatization method on his sleeve. It is his sleeve. Unfortunately, convincing yourself that you were hurt is more than half the battle of anybody suffering with a trauma disorder. And sometimes you never quite get there. However, I will take this point in the video to say that there are resources in the description below, not only for people suffering with trauma disorders, but also for anybody that has experienced abuse of any kind. There's going to be resources in the description because there is help out there and it can get better. It has gotten better for me. So, from my own personal experience, I can tell you that I do believe there is a way to take your life back, in whatever form that may come in, and you are worth getting help. The fourth thing that I wanted to notice is, interestingly enough, the mask. Now, this is entirely personal, but I have a reason to believe that the mask is a protection mechanism. Whenever I'm particularly triggered for days on end, I'll usually cover up with a mask. Not because I'm sick, but because I hate the feeling of others looking at me. Hiding my face serves as a protection, a safety blanket, if you will. I believe that it may be the same way for Kyo because, as we've established, Kyo was actually traumatized by his sister, brainwashing or not. And what is he still wearing in his pre-game sequence? A mask. The gist of this video is this: Danganronpa writers fucking suck and I've now done all the heavy lifting for them. Jokes aside, I don't think Kyo was actually a serial killer pre-game. Obviously he did kill 2 victims in Trial 3, but I don't think that that was the way he was before he entered the killing game. I think that that part specifically was a manifestation of the personality that the brainwashing created for him in order to get views and ratings and all of that TV stuff. I do, however, think that because of his pre-existing trauma, his created backstory was rough. Also, due to Kyo's strange and off-putting aura, there are victims out there, me included, that see his strange mannerisms and little physicalities as representation in a sort of way. Though I do completely agree with the side that there are victims that think that the way that this was handled and the way that his trauma was portrayed as something sick and taboo and funny and crazy and oh my god, I'm a serial killer, like, that wasn't okay. So I also completely understand if you don't like this character because of the way that all was handled for the sake of the killing game. Much in the same way that it is completely understandable that a lot of people who suffer with DID do not like the character of Toko Fukawa. Because, of course, the writers of Danganronpa had to make her other personality not only triggered with a fucking sneeze, but also a goddamn serial killer. Danganronpa writers sure do have a funny way of writing mental illness and other such disorders and neurodivergencies. Kyo's story is ugly, and there's a great chance that the trauma wasn't the DR team's intent. He may have simply been created for shock value and crude humor, but seeing that he was never actually a serial killer before entering V3, maybe he was just suffering from complex trauma. Thanks for watching.